This is a hobby author publishing presentation, where my hobby is your entertainment. Welcome back to Shadows of Secrets. Exiled and alone, Gerrod has left the pristine forests of his youth behind. His quest for answers about his mother, Alicia, has led him here, to the sprawling, corrupt heart of Oswegonia. But this city is a beast of stone and steel, and it does not welcome outsiders. Today, in Chapter 3, The City's Embrace, Gerrod will learn that the walls of prejudice can be as high as any fortress, and that in a city ruled by greed and shadow, even finding a place to sleep can be a battle for survival.
Wefpub Origins Book 1, Shadows of Secrets, A Tale of Friendship and Discovery. Written by Roger Carr. Chapter 3, The City's Embrace. The heat of the city hit him first, stifling and thick like an iron forge. Smoke curled up from chimneys, blending with the sour tang of unwashed bodies and the sharp scent of metal from nearby smithies. The streets hummed with an almost frantic energy. Footsteps pounded against cobblestones, merchants shouted their wares, and the distant clamor of a brawl echoed from an alleyway. Gerrod flinched at the noise, his senses battered by the rush of voices and clanking carts. His eyes darted over the towering stone walls, the dirty buildings crammed together like overcrowded trees in a forest. Here, the air was heavy with the weight of people's lives, a far cry from the clean, open spaces of verdant haven. His heart tightened at the unfamiliarity, the absence of open fields, of silence broken only by the wind and birdsong. He drew in a steadying breath, trying to calm the rise of unease. He could feel the pull of the crowd, the pressure of bodies brushing against him, forcing him forward. Each step took him farther from the peaceful forest and closer to the life he sought, the life his mother had lived, if only he could find her. As the stench of sweat and food thickened, a sharp pang of longing struck him for the quiet, the peace he had left behind. He swallowed, squaring his shoulders, determined to push forward. As Gerrod made his way deeper into the city, the whispers followed him like an unseen shadow. Glances, quick and sharp, flicked his way, eyes narrowing when they saw the faint point of his ears, the subtle sharpness of his features. The murmurs were low but unmistakable. "Half-breed," one voice hissed. Another muttered, "Elven scum." He ignored them, keeping his head down, but the sting of those words bit deeper than he cared to admit. The air seemed to grow thicker, oppressive, each glance a weight pressing down on his chest. It wasn't the first time, of course. He'd known the world would be like this. Yet, it still shocked him how quickly the city's disdain could come to the surface, like a dagger's flash in the dark. He passed a butcher's stall, where the grizzled merchant's lip curled as he saw Gerrod's pointed ears. "Keep to your own kind," the man spat, wiping his hands on a stained apron. A cold, hard knot tightened in Gerrod's stomach. His elven blood was no gift in this place. It was a curse, a mark that made him a target. He had been exiled from his own people, forced to live apart from his kind. And now, even among humans, he found himself unwanted, an outsider. His pace quickened, his fists clenching at his sides, determined to push past it all. This city had no place for him, but he had come to find something, or someone, and he would not let this narrow world stand in his way. Gerrod's senses prickled. Something was wrong. He felt it first in the air, a sudden shift, a quiet tension that slipped beneath the noise of the city. His eyes flicked toward the alley ahead, where shadows pooled like ink. A figure stood there, hooded and still, unmoving amid the rush of life around them. The figure's posture was too deliberate, too concealed, a quiet beacon in the chaos. The faintest creak of leather echoed in the stillness, and Gerrod's hand instinctively dropped to the hilt of his blade. His heartbeat quickened, the familiar weight of his weapon grounding him. He could see nothing of the figure's face, only the shadowed outline of their form, but his instincts screamed danger. There was something deliberate about their presence, something that didn't belong in the flow of life here. The figure's head tilted ever so slightly, as if sensing his gaze, as if inviting him to step closer. A wave of unease curled around Gerrod, but curiosity tugged at him. He wasn't certain what kind of danger this figure might be, but the city's weight of indifference and hostility pressed against him. He had to know who or what lingered in the dark. His breath slowed, and he took a step forward, eyes never leaving the hooded figure. The city's pulse thrummed louder around him, but the alley felt quieter, suspended, as if the world held its breath. The wooden door of the Wayfarer's Rest creaked as Gerrod pushed it open, a gust of musty air hitting him like an old memory. Inside, the dim light of lanterns flickered against walls that had seen too many years of travelers and stories. The smell of roasted meat, spilled ale, and sweat hung thick in the air, mingling with the warmth that pulsed from the hearth. He hesitated at the threshold, eyes scanning the room. It was a refuge for weary souls, no doubt, but there was an undercurrent here, something lurking beneath the jovial laughter and clinking of mugs. The patrons were a mix of hardened men and women, rough from the road, eyes wary like his own. A few glanced at him as he entered, noting the way his boots scraped against the floor, the green of his eyes too sharp among the smoke and shadows. He made his way to the bar, slipping past a rowdy group of sailors. The bartender, a stocky woman with graying hair, shot him a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "What'll it be?" she asked, her voice rough. "A room, and something to drink," Gerrod replied, his tone more curt than he intended. She nodded, sliding a tankard across the counter. As he took it, his fingers brushed against hers. The touch was cold, distant, like the city itself. He could feel the weight of her gaze on him as he turned away, but he didn't look back. The city was full of contradictions. Beneath its warmth and noise, something darker simmered. And Gerrod couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of something he wasn't ready to face. Gerrod had barely taken a sip of his ale when the barmaid leaned in closer, her breath a mix of smoke and bitterness. Her hands rested on the counter, her fingers twitching nervously as she studied him, eyes flicking toward the door before locking onto his with a sharpness that made his skin prickle. "You're not from around here," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. Gerrod met her gaze, wary but not surprised. "No." She didn't blink. "You'd best watch yourself, stranger. There are shadows in Oswegonia, ones that creep in when you least expect it. People like you don't last long if you're not careful." Her words weren't meant as a threat, but they carried weight, heavy with something unspoken. He leaned in slightly, intrigued despite himself. "What do you mean?" She glanced over her shoulder, as if to make sure no one was listening. "There's always something more under the surface here. The city's built on secrets. Some folks call it the heart of trade, but I've seen the darker side, the kind that takes without asking, the kind that follows you home." Her eyes flickered down to his belt, then back to his face, as though daring him to ask more. Gerrod's pulse quickened. The tension in her voice felt like a warning. He could almost taste the fear in her words. He nodded slowly, but inside, a cold knot of unease twisted tighter. Whatever it was she feared, it had found its way into the heart of Oswegonia, and perhaps into him as well. The morning air was thick with the scent of rain yet to fall as Gerrod stepped out of the Wayfarer's Rest, a quiet tension already settling in his chest. The city's chaotic rhythm stirred around him, but he wasn't focused on the noise. Not yet. His eyes scanned the stable yard where he had left his horse, but the familiar chestnut mare was gone. His heart skipped. He jogged to the stable door, pushing it open with a sharp creak. Empty stalls. The hay was disturbed, the scent of it fresh, but there was no sign of his horse. Panic bubbled up beneath his ribs, tight and fast. He swallowed hard, forcing the rising tide of anger down. It couldn't be a coincidence. His hand instinctively went to the dagger at his side. A thief. The city's underside had already begun to show itself. He'd barely stepped foot in Oswegonia, and already he was a target. He turned on his heel, heading back toward the inn, his boots slapping against the cobblestones. The morning light didn't feel quite as warm anymore. His trust in the city, what little there had been, dissolved with each step. If someone had taken his horse, they weren't just after a piece of leather and flesh. They were sending a message. No more waiting. Gerrod's eyes narrowed. He had come to this city seeking answers, but it was clear now. Oswegonia had its own secrets, and they were already coming for him. Gerrod approached the city guard station, his footsteps sharp against the cobblestones. He had hoped, foolishly, that the law might offer some relief, that at least someone here would take his loss seriously. He pushed through the heavy wooden door and into the dim, smoky room, where the sour stench of sweat and stale ale clung to the air. A few guards sat behind a rickety counter, their eyes heavy, their faces uninterested. One of them, a lanky man with a crooked nose, looked up as Gerrod approached. "What is it now, traveler?" His voice was thick with the kind of tired arrogance that only years of laziness could cultivate. "My horse was stolen," Gerrod said, keeping his voice steady, though frustration laced his words. "I need help tracking it down." The guard snorted, looking him over like he'd just spoken nonsense. "A horse, eh? Lost a horse, did you? Well, I'd say that's your problem, not ours." He turned away, wiping the grime off his hands with a rag. Another guard, a heavier man with a permanent scowl, leaned forward. "You want help? You'll need to pay for it. And maybe a little more for someone to actually care," he muttered, barely looking up. His eyes flicked over Gerrod's plain clothes with disdain. Gerrod's grip tightened on the edge of the counter. He had expected nothing less from a city that had already shown its ugly side. "So that's it then? You won't even?" The lanky guard cut him off with a dismissive wave. "Unless you've got coin to spare, you'd best get out. Or do you need us to help you find your way back to the street?" A cold wave of anger washed over Gerrod, but he held his ground. The system here wasn't built for justice. It was built for those with enough to buy it. With a sharp breath, he turned on his heel and left, the weight of the city's indifference pressing down on him with each step. The horse was gone, but so was any pretense that Oswegonia would be a place of refuge. Gerrod's jaw tightened as he stepped back into the street, the noise of the city swirling around him like a storm. The guard station was no more than a mockery of justice, a reminder that in this city, you had to carve your own path. His hand curled into a fist at his side. No one would help him. Fine, he didn't need them. He scanned the crowd, his eyes sharp, his instincts, honed in the wilds, trained in solitude, kicked in. He would find his horse. There was no other choice. Turning away from the bustle of the market, Gerrod made his way down side streets, his steps quick and purposeful. He kept to the shadows, blending in, watching for anything out of place. The city was a maze of alleys and back doors, the perfect place for thieves to hide, but also the perfect place to find clues others missed. He felt the familiar weight of his dagger at his side, the only tool he needed now. No guards, no coin, just him, his blade, and his determination. He would track the horse down like any other prey. Each corner he rounded, each step closer to uncovering the truth, burned away the frustration, replaced with cold focus. Gerrod had lived in the wilds. He knew how to survive. And here, in this city of iron and stone, he would do the same. The crowds pressed in on Gerrod like an unrelenting tide, their voices a low murmur that buzzed in his ears. He ducked past a group of merchants, their carts overflowing with wares, the sharp smell of spices and rotting fruit assaulting his senses. The air, thick with heat and dust, felt stifling, heavy against his lungs. It was suffocating, this city, with its ceaseless motion and clamor that seemed to swallow him whole. The faces around him were unfamiliar, blank, indifferent. The eyes that met his weren't curious. They were dismissive, cold. His elven heritage, the slight point of his ears, marked him as different, and in this place, different meant unwanted. He could feel the judgment in every glance, the subtle, practiced sneer that followed him down the streets. He wasn't part of this world, this frantic dance of humanity. He was an outsider, a reminder of something they preferred to ignore. Gerrod's hand tightened around the strap of his pack as he moved through the crowd, trying to ignore the growing unease that gnawed at him. The noise, the constant push and pull of bodies, was deafening. It was all so foreign, so alien to him. There was no space to breathe here, no room for quiet reflection. The city felt like a trap, its people little more than cogs in a machine, and Gerrod was a gear that didn't fit. He longed for the stillness of verdant haven, the silence of the forests where every breath had meaning. Here, in Oswegonia, he was nothing but a shadow among shadows, unseen, unwanted, and lost. As Gerrod made his way through the bustling market square, the stares grew sharper, more pointed. A child tugged at his mother's sleeve, whispering something he couldn't catch. But the woman's gaze slid over him with a look of such thinly veiled contempt that it made his stomach turn. He tried to shake it off, to ignore the familiar sting, but it clung to him like smoke. A vendor, his stall brimming with dried herbs, caught Gerrod's eye. As their gazes met, the man's expression flickered, recognition, then something darker. His mouth curled into a tight, thin smile, and he shook his head with a soft chuckle. "Better keep moving, elf," he muttered, just loud enough for Gerrod to hear. "Don't want to make trouble in the wrong place." Gerrod's fists clenched, but he didn't respond. There was no use. The words weren't new. They never were. A group of soldiers strolled by, their armor clinking with each step. One of them eyed Gerrod with disdain, his lip curling in a sneer. "Didn't know they let your kind walk freely in the city," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Hope you're not here to start any trouble." The words stung worse than any blow, and Gerrod's throat tightened. His shoulders stiffened as he tried to push past them, but they parted just enough to make sure his path was blocked, the air thick with unspoken judgment. Each glance, each whispered word, pushed him farther into himself, like a stone sinking into a deep, dark pool. He was nothing here. Just a half-elf, a stray, an unwelcome guest in a city that made it clear he was not wanted. The weight of it was suffocating. His feet felt heavier with every step, his breath catching in his chest. How much longer could he stay in this place, this prison of indifference, before it consumed him completely? By the time Gerrod reached the Silver Steed, dusk had settled heavily over Oswegonia, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. His shoulders ached, and fatigue pressed down on him like a physical weight. The inn stood at the corner of a quiet street, its sign creaking in the wind. He could hear the low murmur of voices inside, the warmth beckoning him like a distant memory. One last chance. He pushed open the door, and the rush of heat and light hit him. The scent of roasting meat and wood smoke filled the air, but the moment he stepped inside, the room fell into a thick silence. The laughter, the clinking of glasses, the chatter, all ceased. Every pair of eyes turned toward him. The subtle glances, the discomfort in the room, were unmistakable. Behind the bar, a woman with sharp features and a hard expression sized him up, her gaze lingering on his pointed ears before hardening. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she wiped down a mug slowly, her movements deliberate. Then, with a voice that was as cold as the stone walls, she spoke. "We don't serve your kind here." The words struck like a blow to his chest, knocking the breath from him. His pulse quickened, but he stood still, trying to hold on to the calm he fought so hard to maintain. "I just need a bed for the night," Gerrod said, his voice tight but steady. She didn't respond, just turned away to tend to another customer, clearly dismissing him as though he were nothing more than an annoyance. The room had already returned to its previous hum, as though he were a ghost, a brief interruption to their comfort. Gerrod's throat tightened. His fists clenched, but he didn't say anything. He couldn't. The door swung open behind him, the weight of the city's rejection heavy on his shoulders. The cold night air rushed in as he left, each step away from the Silver Steed, carrying the bitter taste of failure, of a place he would never belong. Gerrod stepped back into the street, the weight of the innkeeper's cold words still pressing down on him like a stone. His throat burned, not from the words themselves, but from the injustice, the reminder that no matter how hard he tried, he would always be an outsider here. The city seemed to close in around him, its walls a constant reminder of everything he didn't belong to. But beneath the sting, something else stirred, a flicker of defiance. He straightened his shoulders, the chill of the night air sharp against his skin. He couldn't let this city break him. It would take more than rejection, more than the sneers and dismissive words to push him away. The fire in his chest grew, not in anger, but in resolve. He had come to Oswegonia to find something, to uncover the truth of his heritage, to stand on his own. That hadn't changed, and no one, no matter how many looks, how many closed doors, was going to take that from him. Gerrod's eyes narrowed as he turned away from the inn, his footsteps firm and purposeful. The city had rejected him, but he would find a way to make it his own. There was a place for him here, a purpose he would carve from the stone and steel of Oswegonia. He wasn't here by accident. He had a reason. The night swallowed him up as he disappeared into the maze of streets, the city's pulse a dull hum beneath his boots. He would find it, his place, his answers, one way or another. By the time Gerrod reached the Salty Seahorse, the city had worn away most of his resolve, leaving behind only the raw edges of frustration and wariness. The tavern, tucked away on a narrow side street, seemed humble enough, a far cry from the polished, proud inns he'd been turned away from. A faded sign swayed above the door, its paint chipped, the scent of brine and stale ale thick in the air. He hesitated at the entrance, but something inside him pushed him forward. Maybe it was the quiet call of hope, the last ember of his will to keep moving. The door creaked open, and a rush of warmth greeted him. But it wasn't the bustling warmth of a city eager to turn a profit. No, this place felt different, familiar even. The low murmur of voices didn't stop when he entered. In fact, no one paid him any mind at all. The dimly lit room was full of sailors and wanderers, their weathered faces lined with stories of the sea. Behind the bar, a stout woman with thick salt and pepper hair gave him a long, appraising look. Gerrod expected the same cold reception, the same dismissive glance, but instead, she simply nodded to him, her eyes softening. "Need a drink, traveler?" Her voice was low, gruff, but there was an understanding in it, a recognition that made him feel, for the first time since he'd set foot in Oswegonia, like he wasn't so alone. He gave a tight nod, finally releasing a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. No judgment in her eyes, no sneers, just a quiet acceptance. Gerrod took a seat at the bar, the warmth of the room slowly settling into his bones. Maybe there were places in this city where he could find something more than rejection. Maybe, just maybe, Oswegonia wasn't entirely lost to him. Not yet. Gerrod settled onto a worn wooden stool, the familiar weight of his exhaustion sinking into his bones as he surveyed the room. The Salty Seahorse was a far cry from the polished inns and bustling market squares. The air was thick with the scent of salt, smoke, and something more grounded. Life lived in the margins. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls, and the low hum of conversation wove through the room like a thread, steady and unhurried. Patrons sat at crooked tables, their faces weathered and rough, marked by the sea and the years spent far from the comforts of city life. A few sailors shared tales of distant lands, their voices rising and falling in animated exchange. A grizzled old man, his hands calloused and worn, hunched over a mug of ale, staring into the fire as if seeking something only it could offer. The atmosphere was warm, but not in the brash, suffocating way the other taverns had been. There was an ease here, a quiet understanding that spoke more of survival than luxury. The laughter was genuine, the silences comfortable. No one stared at him. No one whispered behind their hands. The weight of being different, of being an outsider, felt lighter here, if only for a moment. Gerrod breathed in deeply, letting the tension in his chest ease. The city's chaos seemed to fade into the background, and for the first time since his arrival, he could almost believe that he might find peace. Maybe this place was an exception, a sliver of quiet amidst the storm. But for now, it was enough. Mylinda approached the bar with the grace of someone who'd spent years navigating the narrow gaps between tables and customers, her hands steady as she filled a mug with ale. She was small, even for a halfling, but her presence seemed to fill the space with a warmth that Gerrod hadn't realized he'd been missing. Her hair was pulled back into a loose braid, and her round face was framed by a pair of bright green eyes that held a quiet knowing. She set the mug down in front of him with a soft smile. "You look like you've been through the mill," she said, her voice light, yet carrying an undertone of sincerity that made Gerrod pause. "Something tells me you don't belong to the city much longer than your boots have been here." Gerrod met her gaze, surprised by the softness in her tone. He shrugged, tired. "It's been a rough day." Her eyes flicked over his travel-worn clothes, the slight tension in his shoulders, and she leaned against the bar, crossing her arms comfortably. "Oswegonia has a way of chewing people up, especially those who don't fit the mold." She said it with the kind of understanding that came from experience, not just observation. "You've got a lot more spirit than it gives credit for, though." The unexpected empathy caught him off guard. He hadn't expected kindness, not after everything he'd faced in the city. "I'm not sure I'll fit in here at all," Gerrod admitted, his voice lower than usual, as if speaking the truth might make it real. Mylinda nodded slowly, her expression softening. "Most who end up here don't, but this place, it's got room for a few lost souls." She paused, her eyes meeting his with a quiet intensity. And some folks, well, they make their own space, no matter what anyone else says. Gerrod felt something in his chest loosen, as though a door he hadn't realized was shut had cracked open, just a little. The city, cold and indifferent as it was, might have its cracks. Maybe there was a place for him here after all, if only for a while. He met her gaze, grateful for the warmth in her words. "Thanks," he muttered, the first genuine sense of relief he'd felt in days flickering within him. Mylinda smiled again, a flash of quiet encouragement. "You're welcome, but don't get too comfortable yet. If you want the best fish stew in town, you'll need to beat those sailors to it." She winked, and before he could reply, she was off to tend to someone else, leaving behind a lingering sense of reassurance that felt oddly like a promise. As Gerrod sipped his ale, the low murmur of conversation around him began to unravel the city's secrets, bit by bit. Mylinda, noticing his quiet curiosity, leaned in closer as she passed by. "You're new here, right?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the din. When he nodded, she gave him a sympathetic smile. "Let me tell you something about Oswegonia. Nothing here is as simple as it looks." She leaned against the counter, a glint of caution in her eyes. "It's all about who you know and who's pulling the strings. The city's split into pieces, the guilds, the nobility, and then there's the shadows." Gerrod raised an eyebrow. "Shadows?" Mylinda's eyes darted around the room, making sure no one was listening too closely. "They're not the kind of people you want to get tangled up with. The Shadow Myster, they call it. A criminal organization, but it's more than just thieves and cutthroats. They've got their hands in everything. Trade, politics, even the guards. If you're looking for trouble, they'll find you." Gerrod absorbed the words, his thoughts racing. It wasn't surprising, but hearing it so plainly felt like a slap. The city's corruption ran deeper than he'd imagined. The guilds, they're the closest thing Oswegonia has to order. Not that it's much better. The merchants run half the city with their gold, while the noble families squabble over whatever's left. But it's the guilds that keep the heart of this place pumping. Without them, the city wouldn't be worth a damn. "And the nobles?" Gerrod asked. "They're just out for power. Their high towers and fancy dinners mean little to the common folk. But don't mistake that for weakness. They've got soldiers, influence, and more dirty money than the guilds could ever dream of." Mylinda glanced over her shoulder, lowering her voice. "But no matter how hard you fight, you can't get to the top unless you've got someone in the shadows looking out for you. They pull the strings, quietly, behind the scenes." She gave him a pointed look. "Trust me, no one's safe unless they're on the right side of those hidden hands." The weight of it settled on Gerrod, the complexity of the city now clear in its cruel simplicity. It wasn't just about survival here. It was about power, and who was willing to do anything to hold it. He looked into his mug, the ripples in the ale matching the unease crawling up his spine. There was more to Oswegonia than he'd thought, more than just finding his place. His path forward was tangled in webs he hadn't yet begun to untangle. As Gerrod sat nursing his drink, the noise of the tavern began to fade into a soft hum, the crackling fire and quiet chatter creating a rhythmic backdrop. But amid the ambient noise, a conversation at a nearby table caught his attention. Two men, rough-looking and leaning in close as if guarding their words, spoke in hushed tones, unaware of the half-elf's attentive ear. Gerrod shifted slightly, straining to hear without drawing attention to himself. "Shadows are getting bolder," one man muttered, his voice low and gravelly. He paused, glancing around the room. "Even the guilds are starting to feel it. They're squeezing everyone. No one's safe." The second man, with a crooked nose and a nervous twitch to his hand, nodded. I heard they're controlling the docks now. Shipping, trade, everything's got their mark on it. Even the bloody nobles can't avoid them anymore." The first man leaned in closer, his face shadowed by the flickering light. "Not just the docks. It's the whole city. The Shadow Mister's reach goes deep, deeper than anyone knows. The city guards in their pocket, and the watch, they're practically puppets. No one can move without the shadows knowing." Gerrod's pulse quickened, the words striking with an edge of familiarity. It wasn't just whispered rumors. It was something bigger, something far more dangerous than a few criminal syndicates. This was a network, an unseen power that could move through the city like water, shaping everything in its path. The nobles, they keep playing their games, but they're too busy stabbing each other in the back. They don't see who's really controlling things. The man gave a low chuckle, filled with bitterness. Too busy fighting over scraps. The shadows will have it all in the end. The second man looked around nervously, lowering his voice even further. You think they're after the throne? Not yet, came the quiet response. But they're close. They don't need the throne, not when they've got all the power already. Gerrod's grip tightened on his mug. The weight of their words sunk in like a stone in his stomach. It wasn't just a matter of guilds and corruption. The Shadow Myster wasn't a fleeting threat. It was a force that had woven itself into the very fabric of Oswegonia, and it controlled far more than Gerrod could have imagined. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a city he had to navigate. This was a city on the edge of something dark, and he might have just stepped right into its path. Gerrod leaned back against the bar, the weight of the conversation swirling in his mind. The shadow of the Shadow Myster seemed to stretch further than he'd first realized, touching everything in Oswegonia, every corner, every whisper, every fleeting glance. The city, with its towering spires and opulent streets, was nothing more than a mask. Beneath the polished exterior lay rot, a festering corruption that thrived on the desperation of the people. He could feel it now, a pulse beneath his skin, as though the city itself were a living thing, breathing in the misery of its inhabitants. The smiles of the merchant lords and noble families were thin, brittle, their eyes always darting around, measuring risks and rewards. The city guard walked through the streets with a certain heaviness, the iron of their armor not just a tool of protection, but a symbol of oppression. The more Gerrod observed, the more he saw the threads of fear and greed that tied everything together. The poor scraped by in the gutters, their faces gaunt with hunger, while the guilds and the nobility danced on top, oblivious to the decay beneath. But it wasn't just the poor who suffered. It was the very heart of Oswegonia, rotting from the inside out. The realization hit him hard, like the bite of a winter wind. The city wasn't just corrupt. It was a city built on desperation, on exploitation, on lies. And yet, it was thriving, feeding off the very things that should have torn it apart. That made it dangerous, more dangerous than anything he'd ever faced in the wilds. But instead of retreating, Gerrod felt something stir inside him, a flicker of resolve, of defiance. He wasn't here to be another pawn in the game. If this city was going to try to swallow him whole, he would make sure it felt the weight of his resistance. He had his reasons for being here, reasons tied to his heritage, his past. But now, those reasons were beginning to expand, to grow. This wasn't just about uncovering his history anymore. It was about surviving this tangled web of power and corruption. He wasn't going to leave Oswegonia, not yet. But he was going to navigate it, step by careful step. And he would make the city feel every inch of his presence, whether it liked it or not. As Gerrod walked through the narrow streets of Oswegonia, the contrast between this chaotic, jagged city and the tranquil beauty of Verdant Haven hit him like a hammer. In Verdant Haven, life had been simple, ordered, and connected to the earth. The trees whispered through the wind, the streams ran clear and constant, and the air had the clean, fragrant scent of pine and fresh soil. He could always find solace there, amid the serenity of nature, where everything had a rhythm, unhurried and balanced. But here in Oswegonia, the air felt thick, as if it were choked by the very stone and steel that built this place. The streets were crammed with people jostling for space, each face a mixture of exhaustion, suspicion, and hunger. The buildings were imposing, towering above him like jagged cliffs, blocking out the sun and casting long, oppressive shadows. Instead of birdsong, the air was filled with the clatter of carts, the shouts of street vendors, and the faint cries of beggars, their voices lost among the noise. He thought of the rolling hills of Verdant Haven, the way the wind would catch the leaves, how the landscape stretched for miles in peaceful undulations. The city, in comparison, was a machine, grinding its people down, demanding their energy and spirit until nothing remained but hollow shells. His feet hit the cobblestones, worn and uneven beneath him. Every step here felt wrong, as though he was walking on a surface that didn't welcome him, didn't understand him. He missed the open spaces of home, the freedom of the forest where the trees whispered his name, and nature seemed to understand his every thought. But here, he was just one more face in a sea of people, a stranger in a strange land. The noise, the filth, the ever-present sense of unease, it all clung to him, dragging him further from the life he had known. Yet, beneath the layers of discomfort and alienation, something else began to burn within him. He couldn't go back to Verdant Haven. Not now. Not when there were things to discover, truths to unearth in this jagged place. The city was harsh, unyielding, and indifferent to anyone who wasn't part of its machine. But Gerrod was no longer the naive elf who had left. If anything, he had learned to thrive where things were darkest. He would carve his path through Oswegonia's underbelly, just as he had through the wilderness, and find the answers that were hidden beneath the city's grimy skin. The warmth of the fire at the Salty Seahorse wrapped around Gerrod like a familiar cloak, a brief respite from the harshness of the city outside. The tavern, worn and weathered as it was, felt like the only place in Oswegonia that hadn't swallowed him whole. He leaned back in his chair, the steady creak of the wood beneath him almost comforting in its predictability. The chatter around him was low, the steady clink of tankards and the hum of conversation mingling with the crackling fire. Here, in this small corner of the city, the world felt just a little less cold. The patrons seemed indifferent to his presence. Their eyes glazed with the wariness of lives lived on the edge, but they didn't stare at him, didn't whisper behind their hands. It was a kind of acceptance, unspoken but present in the way they carried themselves, lives unbothered by the same expectations that had weighed him down since his arrival. The air smelled of salt and seaweed, the remnants of some faraway land, but also of home, a faint reminder of the forests and rivers of Verdant Haven. Here, there was no judgment, no rejection, just the quiet hum of survival. Mylinda, the halfling barmaid, moved effortlessly through the room, a warm smile always ready for anyone who needed it. She caught Gerrod's eye across the room, a silent understanding passing between them. She didn't ask questions, didn't probe. She simply offered him space to breathe, a kind of unspoken refuge in a place where few others could offer it. For the first time since setting foot in Oswegonia, Gerrod felt the weight in his chest ease, just a little. The city had shown him its ugliness, its power games, and its endless prejudice. Yet here, in this small tavern, there was room for him, if only for a moment. The chaos of the streets, the rejection from inns and guards, faded into the background as he allowed himself a brief, hard-won sense of peace. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to remind him that amidst the city's ugliness, there were still corners where he could draw breath. It wasn't home, and it might never be. But for now, the Salty Seahorse was the closest thing to safety he had. And for a moment, that was all he needed.
Rejected, scorned, and hunted, Gerrod has found a sliver of peace in the city's forgotten corners. But the whispers in the Salty Seahorse speak of a deeper rot. The guilds, the nobles, and a mysterious power known only as the Shadow Myster, whose unseen hands pull the strings of the entire city. Gerrod came seeking his past, but he stumbled into a war for Oswegonia's soul. What is the true extent of the guild's power, and how deep does the corruption run? Find out next time in Chapter 4, The Guild's Grip. If you want to uncover the city's secrets with us, make sure you're subscribed. Until then,